Good morning. I'm Heather Hendrickson. I'm the director of the Office for Sustainability at Harvard. And it's my pleasure. I, Julie Newman, and Bernd Casimir are going to welcome you this morning. So I'll start because we're here at Harvard. So on behalf of Harvard University and the Office for Sustainability, I'm delighted to welcome you to the 8th ISCN Annual Conference. I've been fortunate to attend several of these and have been engaged in the ISCN through Jack Spengler and Bernd Casimir for the 6 years that I've been here as Sustainability Director. So I have to say, we had a great pre-conference yesterday, and seeing all of you here this morning, and surprisingly, no one looks really jet-lagged. I'm very impressed. We'll see how we'll have some more coffee in the afternoon. I'm honored to be part of this group because there are so many talented leaders from different countries and cultures with a deep and broad knowledge of not only sustainability, but I think change management. You are an impressive group of people from 34 countries, 76 universities. We have 40 of the 60 ISCN member organizations here with us today. And you represent sustainability practitioners, senior administrators, as well as faculty. And also some very impressive nonprofits like the UNEP group and ASHI are here with us. It's also exciting to see in Zena, I look like I have all these stats, it's thanks to Zena, that the attendance by region is approximately evenly matched for Europe, Asia Pacific, and the US. And that our colleagues and friends from the Middle East and Africa have really grown their attendance, and they're about a third of the other groups. So I think that is a tremendous accomplishment. And it also buoys me for what we're going to be able to do. So Harvard's been looking forward to hosting you since last June, and we're thrilled to have worked collaboratively not only with the ISCN, but with MIT to create a framework for this conference. We hope to be a model that there is strength in collaboration, there in sharing ideas without regard to who specifically gets credit, and to admitting where we do not have all the answers, but together we can ask the right questions and create the solutions. We've just been waiting for all of you. And as we make this conference come to life, we determine, you will determine really how successful we are. Not only can we talk about our conference themes under the umbrella of pushing boundaries, they are innovation. You're going to know these by heart by the end. Innovation, collaboration, scalability, and metrics. So not only do we want to talk about these, but I think we also want to know how we can leverage each other's ideas and institutions to demonstrate change and solve global challenges and show how a collective is indeed more powerful than our individual institutions that we represent. So that's a lofty goal that we've created. But we know you're up to the challenge. So a bit about Harvard, and then back to sort of what we want to accomplish today in the next couple of days. So I think, as many of you know, we've been committed to sustainability for a few decades. We had building on a successful faculty staff initiative that launched in 2001. And was co-founded in part by Jack Spengler, who's here with us today. Our president formalized in 2008 a formal university-wide sustainability office. At the same time, our deans and corporations agreed to a very aggressive goal to address climate on our campus that was based not on what we thought we could achieve, but on what the scientific community was telling us was necessary. So you'll hear more about that from our executive vice president later today. But more importantly, I think what this commitment afforded us was the opportunity to translate the senior leadership support into a clear vision of where we were headed, not only related to climate change, but advancing and implementing a 2016 and beyond carbon plan. And at its heart embraces not only the definition of sustainability, but focuses on how to truly hold ourselves accountable for the ultimate goal of ensuring health and well-being, the sustainability of people and our planet. As we launch our Evolve Sustainability Strategy this coming year, we build on 2 key areas of focus. One, we've worked with Jack and other researchers from the School of Public Health and Medical School predominantly, and students, and that is to better define and shape the linkages between health and sustainability. There's no greater goal than to ensure, I think, that we leave the next generation with a healthier environment and enable them to flourish. I also think that that not only is that this is at the heart of the definition of sustainable development, but I think this is where our hearts rest. Does everyone feel like the health of your family and your friends and your loved ones is the most important thing? I do, and I think most importantly that this, as we've seen here, it demonstrates that it transcends culture and countries and thoughts. And I think moving people to action, not only on climate change, but on sustainability more broadly and more rapidly, is going to take that focus from the heart. I certainly know that in the United States, where we have been the laggards on addressing climate change as a country. So maybe not in higher ed. So the other area we've been focused on for the last several years are partnerships on campus and building that muscle memory. Harvard's a very decentralized place. We have 12 schools and units that run completely independently of each other. So it's much more analogous to a municipality or a large corporation with a weak sort of parent, and don't tell the president I referred to her as weak, and strong divisions. So we really have worked on those partnerships on campus, but also beyond. You're going to hear a little bit about the Cambridge Compact for a Sustainable Future. We're delighted to have our former mayor, Henrietta Davis, in the audience, whose brainchild this was, and she forced us lovingly to get there. You'll hear a little bit about the Boston Green Ribbon Commission, which is similar, but again is focused with multi-sectors coming together to address change predominantly on climate and both from a mitigation and preparedness perspective. There's the ISCN, of course, which is us. I hold the most hope for this because it's global. And then other partnerships that amplify and improve our impact. I think we all agree that the challenges that we face are just too complex. They're interwoven and they're global. So we cannot solve them on our individual campuses or even within our individual countries. We must work together, not only in higher ed with our faculty, students, and staff, but with governments and colleagues in the private sector and the nonprofit sector. So we've been focused on this for the last couple of years. So Harvard and MIT's progress, you'll hear from Julie about MIT, are just 2 examples. Yet the most powerful example, I think, is the progress that we collectively make and a vision for evolving to a new paradigm. Julie likes to call it the next generation. My grad school time at the Kennedy School here, which is a very international school, makes me convinced that our faculty are certainly brilliant, and they will play a significant role in our transition to this next level. But it's really our peers and the students who are out in the world and represent the world and must leverage the research and teaching to, as Mahatma Gandhi said, be the change you wish to see in the world. So you come here to share your knowledge, and I think together we can be successful. Harvard and MIT and ISCN, we put our heads together for the last year. We hope that we hit the mark with our themes and aspirations and goals to play a key role in evolving our field and what we are all so passionate about. We had a great start, I think, with yesterday with our Sustainability 2.0 and our discussions of taking ISCN to the next level globally, collectively, and I think really leveraging the World Economic Forum as we move forward as a platform with our presidents, all of which I think benefits our home institutions and countries. So we're here to ask and answer the right questions as we solidify our vision and priorities and benefit from the collective knowledge and action in this room. We hope to learn from all of you. We hope that you leave with a renewed sense of purpose, a clear vision for how we leverage each other to go farther, faster, by stepping back. This is all about the next couple of days. You can leave your to-do lists and your nitty-gritty plans like we all have behind. We hope that this is a space for you to truly step back. And that by stepping back, we ensure our goals and outcomes are aligned, and that we leave with sort of a long-term shared vision for where we're headed. And as Jack says, the mark of every successful conference is that you also have to have a few things that you can go home and implement immediately. So we hope that we give you, together we create those and give those to you. So finally, I just want to acknowledge that putting on a conference like this takes a village. And I would like to acknowledge the Harvard team, and I know Julie will acknowledge the MIT team. So I want to thank Jacqueline Olson, our assistant director, Jennifer Stacy, our manager, who gave me a binder this morning. This is like everything you want to know about the conference. So if you have any questions, you just come ask me, because thanks to Jennifer, I know. We also want to thank Christian Cole, who's our coordinator, who's out in the lobby, Madeline Meehan from Events that's helped us put this on, and our Harvard volunteers. So we have 3 volunteers. They're in green shirts. Mike Popejoy's right here. He's a PhD candidate here at Harvard, and he's a member of our Council for Student Sustainability Leaders. So he is the future. He is representing the future. We also have Jim Moore here being a volunteer, and Carrie Ayers, who's one of our green team leaders. So she's one of those people that in her office gets people from her department and her school to do everything they can possibly do to green the campus. I also want to thank Zena Harris and Bernd Casimir, because we certainly couldn't have done this without them. And a final thank you to all of you, because as I said at the beginning, we have been waiting for you. And we look forward to gaining from your expertise, your ideas, your frameworks, and your knowledge, as only together, I think, we can quickly, effectively, and with maximum impact, evolve our models and really get us to Sustainability 2.0, which again, the heart of the matter is really about making sure that the next generation lives in a cleaner environment, or at least one as clean as this. I think we can do better. We got a great jump start, as I said yesterday. We had about 50 people who really came up with some good short-term actions, and I think some stakes in the ground of where we could actually go from a long-term vision perspective. And I hope that by Wednesday, our goal is to be able on Wednesday morning to report out sort of what the shapings of that long-term vision are of us working together moving forward, as well as some of those short-term actions towards achieving a sustainable planet and people. So welcome. We're thrilled to have you. We hope you'll also be able to meander the campus, join us for the tour, and we'll be back. We have lunch at the faculty club, right?
Yep.
And we also have dinner at Annenberg, which I think looks like the Harry Potter building. So that's where you're going for dinner. So we look forward to having you all day, and thanks for being here.
So welcome to those of you who haven't been joined this group together. This is a phenomenal group it's a large think tank, and we've really evolved so tremendously over the years. So I too want to welcome you to the 8th annual conference. I've been anticipating this event. I don't know if anybody who was in Singapore last year at dinner when they were announcing that it was going to be at Harvard next year said, come here, we'll do it at MIT too. And so thanks to Jack and Bern, and we were able to pull this off, which I think is fantastic, and only, to be honest, expands your exposure to what's happening in this area. I've been involved with ISCN Network since its inception in 2007, and it's been an incredible journey of helping really build this network over time with Bern and colleagues. And I believe this meeting for me is always a humble reminder of the shared challenges that we face irrespective of latitude and longitude, and that really came out yesterday in our workshop. So it's truly just a humble reminder of our need to embrace the collective intelligence of this innovative community and realize how much we actually have in common, despite that it's our role to bring it back to our own context. but we actually have more in common than we do than not. And I also welcome you to a campus that, not this campus, but to MIT campus, which has been committed to campus sustainability for the past decade or so. But it's actually just now launching its first office of sustainability. So it's a really, for those of you who were with us yesterday, are aware of this, but it's such an intriguing place to be, having been in the field. This is my third office of sustainability that I'm starting, and it's so fascinating to figure out what can I learn from all of you to actually help our team build a brand new model potentially. And so that's what we're here to do today, not only help guide us through this process today, but actually gain from the learnings of all of you and to work with many of you who are actually in the same place, be it Thailand or Malaysia or elsewhere. And we're building this new future embedded in a community fabric that includes an innovation district. It's a city, thanks to our previous mayor and others, that's demonstrated robust civic engagement and forward thinking for sustainability. So it's really a unique place. In Cambridge, there are active discussions on getting to net zero, proposed by citizens, a proposal to develop an eco-district in Kendall Square. For those of you who aren't aware of what an eco-district is, it's a shared vision for creating a sustainable city from the neighborhood up. And in 2013, MIT jointly signed this Cambridge Compact, which you heard a little bit about, the Cambridge Community Compact for a Sustainable Future, which you've heard of, which Heather mentioned, but you'll hear more about this morning. Moreover, MIT and Harvard are two of 58 colleges and universities within the metropolitan Boston area that collectively enroll over 250,000 students. So you'll hear me say that frequently because I'm trying to get my mind around what that potential is. And again, if I keep saying it to you, hopefully that will come back as well and maybe even make you think about your municipal region and figure out what the opportunity for collective engagement is right there. And potentially different than the consortiums that we're used to. And we must think beyond the walls of our own institute and seek to embrace our collective intelligence, resources, and impact. And that's really an up-and-coming framework that I think is, it's a new name for an old paradigm, but I think we're just recognizing how necessary that is, particularly in this field. And we're here today because we collectively agree that universities have an essential role to play in advancing sustainable development at both the local and global level, and that we must embrace our ability to be a scalable laboratory in which to devise, pilot, implement, and evaluate the best sustainable urban strategies of today and the emerging next-gen strategies for tomorrow. And we must continue to advance the science of climate change. We're hearing more and more about that, luckily, in this part of the world, its consequences. Build and test energy and infrastructure models. Develop and test carbon-free technologies, such as solar, wind, and geothermal power, but also find more efficient ways to use carbon-based fuels through improved building materials design, as well as improved vehicle and power plant technologies. So that's a big charge for us. In our efforts to demonstrate these best practices and better and then to cutting edge in limiting carbon emissions, we're also teaching our students who are full participants in this campus-wide effort how to be responsible citizens of the world. And together we're learning how to balance our near-term economic considerations against the long-term health of the environment and future human generations. So as Heather said, just to reiterate, the theme of this year's conference is pushing boundaries, leveraging collective action for global impact. And I believe the ISCN forum is really the perfect forum in which to more closely examine the state of campus sustainability today. So this is not a discussion on case examples. That is what's so phenomenal about this opportunity, and that's what I believe keeps many of us coming back year in and year out and completely being dedicated to the development of this forum, is that this is where we really need to push boundaries here. We need to become uncomfortable. We need to push our thinking beyond how we implement. And some questions I think that I bring into this that I share with all of you, and I have many, but I'll only give you a couple, and I won't share the ones with you from 3 a.m. last night, I promise, unless we're in conversation at breakfast. But what is our collective impact to date? And that's something that we raised yesterday. Are our priorities correctly aligned with the state of the world today? And how often do we have to recalibrate? And my answer to that is I think more frequently than we do, if you're wondering. And will our collective impact lead to a transformative, scalable model that is needed to curb climate change and yield to population growth? And how do we keep that? How do we keep those questions alive? And how do we keep checking in to figure out how are we doing and what impact are we having? So in the end, I have no doubt that you too will feel that the world is a little bit smaller and that you will find common challenges and solutions that cross cultures and push boundaries over the next couple of days. And in the end, it turns out I need to thank my team. So I'd like to, yeah, he's rolling his eyes. So I have to thank Steve Lanou, who has been my colleague for a decade now, and we now get to work together as a team at MIT, which is such a treat. And Susie Jones, who I inherited, also another treat. Oh, raise your hand, Susie. Yep. I don't know what I would do without the two of them. And we're actually in the process of building a new team as well. So we're hiring two. This isn't an advertisement, but we'll next year. Yeah, watch out. I might pick one of you. We're looking to hire two new people, so we'll have a team of 5 before you know it. And I will remind you that you are coming to MIT tomorrow, so we'll be able to host you, and you'll have a chance to experience our new campus. Don't ask me to show you around, or I mean give you directions rather, because as Steve nicely pointed out yesterday, I still get a little lost. All of the buildings are numbered, and so look to Steve and Susie, but I will be there to be charming around anything sustainability. So I'll look to welcome you there tomorrow morning. So thank you, and I believe I'm going to pass it on to Bern. All right, thank you.
So welcome from the side of the ISCN. We are delighted to have you here. As Heather said in her opening remarks, it's the 8th conference, hard to believe. We are actually a network of many institutions that come together informally, regularly, but there's also dedicated members who are with us, who support the ISCN, who benefit from the ISCN infrastructure. My slide says 55. This was a few days ago, so informed me we're at 60 right now. So this is rapidly growing. And as you know, we are organized around 3 principles, just to give us cohesion, give us a language to share what we're doing. We're looking at individual buildings and the sustainable impact. We're looking at overall campus planning, anything from carbon goals to diversity in faculty to affordable education, whatever the campus is doing as a corporation, as a group, so to speak. And also for the integration of research, teaching, and outreach with facilities to get a holistic approach. And you'll hear more about these topics throughout the discussions. In addition to all the members, we're very grateful for their support. I want to point out 5 particular members who are generously allowing us to really run this network. That's EPF Lausanne, ETH Zurich, Nanyang Technological University, National University Singapore, and the University of Hong Kong. We're very grateful for your support, and all of these schools are here to really help us run this platform. We've been talking about models and focus and what we're doing here together. And this is kind of just one version of the typical plan, do, check cycle that every management school has its own flavor, its own version of. But I want to pick on something that both Heather and Julie have mentioned. In the ISCN overall, and in each of the conferences, including this one, we talk about the cutting edge, what are we doing right now with campus study programs at the top, programs, initiatives, tools, how we are managing the challenges of today. We're talking about how to assess achievements, how to share our experience. This is something between high-level digestion, benchmarking. We need some case examples, Julie, even despite what you said, but then we need to digest them and stick them together into larger assessments. It needs to be case grounded, but it needs to go much beyond individual cases. I completely agree with you. But then we also need next generation ideas, new challenges, what's out there? What's the next 5 years, 10 years, 20 years? And every of these conferences has a different flavor. This one particularly is, and this is Heather's and Julie's co-shaping, this is about ideas. This is about looking what's out there, what do we want to accomplish, what's working, what are the obstacles, getting the big concept, the 3,000 feet view. And then, of course, against this background, looking at next steps. For this 3,000 feet view and really seeing how we can move this sector, how we can move the world, we've been talking yesterday in the pre-conf workshop very much also about collaboration. Collaboration with cities, I'm very happy that Henrietta is here with us today, but also collaboration with corporation, the private sector, who has a lot to teach us and who has a lot to learn from us if we do it rightly. And Andre from EPFL will be talking about World Economic Forum interactions with corporations within the next few days. But just to give you a background what's going on in this outside forums, I was really interested to see what this year's World Economic Forum risk assessment came up with. Every year, I think for the 8th years running, or the 9th year, it's pretty much like the ISCN length of time, they do a global risks assessment. And leaders from business, leaders from public policy, leaders from NGOs and academia say, what do you think are the 10 biggies out there that we need to watch out as a global society that are what they call systemic risks? If something goes wrong there, it might trip our societies, might trip our planet. What was really interesting this time is, and I'll come back to this, the list of these challenges, these risks on Wednesday, it was really evenly spaced between economic risk, what would you expect from the World Economic Forum, environmentalists, just as many as economic. They were focusing on water, on climate change mitigation and adaptation, extreme weather events, of course, linked to climate change. In the social grouping, there's food, which is between environmental and social. So there's a lot of things, income disparities, social instability, which are certainly linked to what we do on campus, what we can contribute for the next generation leaders. So the topics we're dealing with here is really the same things that the private sector is grappling with, that governments are grappling with, and how can we come together, how can we all, as a collective, move this forward and making sure that we are ahead of the risk curve is something that I think we should be focusing in this 3 days. And I think, Davis, you said it yesterday, I don't know who the quote was from, but somebody said about 100 years ago, the future is always a race between catastrophe and education, and we're trying just to stay ahead of the catastrophe and making sure our future is bright and our education, our research contributes to that. That being said, these are global risks. They need a global group to address this. Heather very gratefully pointed this out, that this is something of the strength here. We very much want to work with local and regional groups. We're very happy to have HE on board here and EUC from the UK. But we need a global forum, and we want to work together with the UN, and Mahesh is here, and that's great. This also means, in addition to global membership, we need global traveling. So the conferences have been traveling around since we started in Switzerland. We were at Shanghai, we were at Gothenburg, we were at Oregon, Singapore, now we're here at Harvard and MIT. The next 2 conferences are going to be announced tomorrow night at the awards dinner. So this is a wonderful journey we're having with all of you. There, of course, as we know, is the downside to it. Global traveling has environmental impacts. And to make sure we are as responsible as we can be, the travel of this conference has been set off as of yesterday. So we know no carbon cycles are perfect, but at least we want to contribute a little bit and give back a little bit and make sure we're running this organization responsibly as much as possible. To close out, I really want to thank again the great teams, the Harvard team, leadership of Heather and Jacqueline. Jennifer, Stacy, and Christian Cole have been very, very, very dedicated to run a very complex registration process because we were totally oversubscribed. So there were multiple layers of waiting lists and members and non-members, and they did a great job. It was like a chess game to really make this happen. Thank you very much. I want to thank Julie and Steve and the MIT volunteers and team for setting up a wonderful meeting we saw yesterday at the pre-conf, that the buildings also at MIT are very inspiring for collaboration and for, it's space to think, and we're going to see more of tomorrow. And I also really want to thank my colleagues from the ISCN, foremost Zena Harris, who really is co-running this organization with me, but also Heather Vickery, Matt Gardner will be here in the afternoon, and other people who helped. This has been a tremendous collaboration, very enjoyable, very intense, and I think we're looking forward to a very inspiring conference. Welcome, and thank you very much.
It is my pleasure to introduce a panel of colleagues, new and old. And we're through this team of MIT and Harvard, we came up with this model in which, starting today, we'll have 2 similar panels. We have a thought leader who's meant to be provocative, around the subject at hand, and then 3 folks who will provide various perspectives on that. We've allowed, one of the things we've observed from past ISCN conferences is that you all bring, as you can imagine, a dynamic perspective and series of questions and comments. So one of some of the feedback we got from the past couple of years is that we always need a little bit more time for dialogue. So we've purposely set this up so that you'll have a chance to hear from 4 remarkable thought leaders, and then plenty of time for some exchange between them, and lots of room for information and exchange, opportunity for questions and comments in between, after. So let me begin. Our panel input presenter is Kent Larson, a new colleague from MIT. He's the director of the MIT Media Lab's Changing Places Group and the School of Architecture and Planning's House and Research Consortium. He's author of Louis I. Kahn, Unbuilt Masterworks, which was selected as one of the top of the 10 best books in architecture for 2000 by the New York Times. And his current research focuses on responsive urban housing, new urban vehicles, ubiquitous technologies, and living lab experiments. So I think you'll really enjoy hearing from him. Joining him are 3 panelists, another new colleague of mine, John Fernandez. He's professor and director of MIT's Building Technology Program and International Design Center, and he's the author of Material Architecture, Emergent Materials for Innovative Buildings and Ecological Construction. Let me just note that there's one other book that's not mentioned, which has become a really wonderful resource for me personally, is on urban metabolism. And so I highly recommend taking a look at that, which he co-wrote with a colleague of his from Portugal, Paulo Ferrer, and it's phenomenal. He'll be joined afterwards by our new colleague, Mahesh Pradhan. He's the chief of the UN Environmental Programs Environmental Education and Training Unit, and he's based out of Nairobi, and he's responsible for promoting UNEP's partnerships with universities in Asia, Latin America, the Caribbean, Europe, and North America. That sounds like a great job. Keep me posted, Mahesh. Davis Bookhart was the founding director of the Office of Sustainability at Johns Hopkins University. He's an old colleague of ours here in the States, and he currently heads the Sustainability Unit at Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. So it's a pleasure to have all 4 of you together. I did note that we must have a thing for men with goatees. Sorry, Mahesh. So I think you're in for a very dynamic panel over the next 2 hours. So Ken, if you can kick us off, that'd be great. Thank you.
So we're looking at different aspects of cities. First of all, how to create very compact, diverse, dense districts within cities. We're looking at alternative mobility networks, how to move people around. We're looking at how we might move towards more local production and consumption. And we're also looking at more efficient use of space and other resources. And actually, I think these are the most important things we can focus on. Technology can play a role in getting us to each of these places. So let's start with the first thing. Walkable, dense, diverse, compact districts. And we're doing this in large part to promote creative interactions and exchange of ideas, but it has the byproduct of creating very sustainable communities. This is looking at a normalized scale here of these things and population increasing on this axis. And you'll notice that the good things in green actually increase at the same rate as the bad things. So you have, as population increases, you tend to have increase in AIDS and crime, actually loss of contact with nature, lots of bad things, and lots of good things happen. Patents go up, GDP goes up, R&D investment goes up. You tend to have much better use of resources like water and energy, and you have much more activity in the arts. You also have this relationship of density to, in this case, transportation, energy. So here's Hong Kong, so we're represented here. So that's, in terms of energy per person, that's about as good as it gets. And it's very, very high density. Houston's about as bad as it gets. Most Most American cities here. Australian cities are here, a little better. European cities are here, but most of the good stuff happens in Asia in terms of energy per person. So you have these interesting relationships of density and good and bad things. This is a study I quite like. It was done by the Urban Land Institute and a group in Singapore. It looks at livability on this axis. They had metrics for that, and population density here, so not surprising. Singapore is highly livable and quite dense. But it's all over the map. So you can have low quality of life, low density cities, all the way to high quality of life, high density cities, and everything in between. So in other words, it's really how you do it. You know, the devil's in the details. This is an example of a high density, low social diversity city. This is not really what you aspire to. This is also not what you aspire to. I took this photograph a couple of weeks ago in Dubai. This is also high density, low social diversity. You know, so it can have negative effects either side. This is from Paris in the 1920s. I mean, people might quibble about whether this is the best example, but this high density, high social diversity, which leads to a lot of good things. I like Paris, but you find as a great example of how to develop these compact districts, but you find many others. Most cities that evolved before the car have this similar pattern. So these are the 20 arrondissements. So this is a 20-minute walking radius, about a mile, and a little denser as you get in close, a little less dense as you get out farther. But in this area here, you've got something over 30,000 people per square kilometer. It's quite dense. And you find people love Paris as an example of a walkable city. A lot of it is because you have this very even distribution of the amenities of life. All these little dots are pharmacies. So there's pharmacies and cafes and everything else within about a 2-minute walk. So we're modeling these cities to try to get the good stuff that comes with density without the bad stuff. That's basically our research agenda. We're modeling them with Lego units. We like to use these little bricks. We can map different scales, like 10 meter, 10 meter, 1 story. We can map data to them. We can say that little brick has 2 workers, if it's a Starbucks, or 300 customers per day. And then we can rapidly model schematically these cities in a pre-architecture way, looking at relationships and data and movement of people. This was a quick model we did of Kendall Square in a workshop. These are a series of 1 square kilometer neighborhoods. I think that's actually kind of the sweet spot for an integrated neighborhood. For a new city in China, Nansha, between Hong Kong and Guangzhou. We did a little study there. All of these are 4 different parties. You see it's natural here, the density in the corners, the canals, et cetera. So we've been able to do that. Then we've said, well, let's make it a little more interactive and actually look at data in real time. So we're experimenting with what we call cityscope, which is 3D projection mapping onto these districts. And we can then toggle through all kinds of visualization and then simulation of the interventions. And we think of this as a collective co-creation decision support system. We want to build a tool that allows non-experts to get involved in that process rather than relying on consultants and experts. So satellite view, looking at mobility modes. This is Kendall Square where I work, so we're using that as a case study. A lot of people say that's a great example of an innovation hub. It's not so great in many respects. It's not very livable in many respects. We can look at the easy stuff. This is the solar radiation, wind flows, things that are a little more interesting we're having a lot of fun with. These are the tweets. So the bigger the blue circle, the more tweets that take place in that area. So you can see 3rd Street is very active, Media Lab is very active, Sloan School is not so active. And then, so this is an example of how it works. So this is one of my students sending a message, #Cityscope, lights up the Media Lab right there, his message is there. So we can look at things like this in real time. We can look at venture funding, where that's located, where the startups are, lots of interesting things. We actually are looking at, because we're the Media Lab at MIT, we like to look at new interfaces. So here, just using hand gestures to paint on the model, in this case, looking at alternative use cases alternative building use scenarios. So here, yellow is residential, and blue is the MIT facilities, et cetera. And you can see that it's very zoned. It's not like Paris at all. It's very concentrated in different areas. Then we said, let's try to use this in real planning examples. So this was a city, new city in Australia. They came to us and they said, we've designed this very walkable city. We said, let's test it. So we built an interactive tool where we can put jobs and housing in various locations, change the density, and do a heat map. The green area is more walkable, the red area is less walkable. We can change this on the fly. In this case, he's moving jobs closer to the housing, the walk score goes up. Now, we really did kind of dumb this down and simplify many of the parameters because we wanted to be able to use this in a 1-hour planning meeting with the people that actually control the zoning, to show them that their stated goals in the zoning were not reflected in the actual ordinance. And I think it was quite effective. We did this for a new district in Riyadh, about a 1 square kilometer area. We find it very interesting. Now we're modeling interactions. We think that's really, really critical to look at how people interact. So here you put a building. This is kind of the movement of people. You think of it sort of as magnetic forces. You have to have sufficient density and proximity in order to trigger interactions. This is a housing project. You get enough density, people start to mix. And some percentage of those interactions will be created where you have a spillover effect and you're exchanging ideas if you have the right diversity and the right density. We're looking at ways of developing planning and architectural strategies to manage density, looking at case studies like Roppongi Hills, where you have this ground floor, street level, streetscape access to all the high-end retail stores, and then an upper level, this connects to Mori Tower, where you have the gardens and the parks, and it's more quiet away from the traffic. And then these functional spaces, so towers, the residential and office, and they can just be extruded up as high as you want, so you can kind of parametrically dial in the density. This 2-level strategy only works with sufficient density. So these are the things we're looking at. The green things are what we've largely already done, completed. Things like movement of people and vehicle. These are the things we're really excited about working on going forward. So creative collision zones, livability, productivity, culture zones, all those kind of things. So number 2, mobility on demand. If you have high density, you're going to have traffic problems if you're based on an automobile, private use of automobiles. So we're looking at this ecosystem of different mobility modes, all of which are shared use. You privilege walking, and then you can add bikes and electric bikes and trams to connect these little 3-wheelers. The vehicles in red are the ones that we've developed in our lab. So for example, this little 3-wheel vehicle is to be integrated with a bike sharing program. You identify yourself. We have dynamic mapping of the human input according to your physiology. So if you're a little old lady, it's a switch when you pedal, because you have to pedal the EU regulations for bike lane vehicle. If you're an athlete, you might have to work harder to go faster. We also developed this very small 2-passenger urban vehicle. It gets the equivalent of 200 miles to the gallon. It has robotic wheels, so you don't have an engine transmission. You can fold. It goes nose into the curb. The length then is the width of a conventional car, and you get 3.5 spaces to one conventional car. You step directly out. It can kind of kneel down if you're an elderly person. So that's an example of a project that we commercialized. We worked with a sponsor. We took about 18 months, had 6 graduate students working on this, and we got to a full-scale prototype. By the way, the yoke flips left, right, so Hong Kong, mainland China, the same day. And they kept all the essential features. We launched this at the EU headquarters in Brussels in 2012. We're now looking at integrating these 3 concepts, which is autonomy, vehicle sharing, and electrification. Those I think, are the really 3 powerful features that come together. So if you can park a vehicle like this and fold it and charge it autonomously, you can actually get a 5-to-1 ratio. And if this is vehicle sharing, you can serve about 10 times as many people with a single vehicle, so you get up to a 50-to-1 utilization increase of vehicles. So we're now looking at what happens in a city, in a neighborhood like Kendall Square, where you have these kind of autonomous vehicles that are communicating with each other. You have infrastructure in the city. It's, they can pick you up, drop you off anywhere. It means you get rid of traffic lights, no parking lots, you redesign pathways, and you can integrate this very easily with other modes. So I think this will change cities profoundly. We're also looking at local production and consumption. There's a lot of ways you can focus on this, but maybe the most interesting is food. This is not really a workable future, we don't believe. It's not very sustainable. And by the way, about 20% of the farmland in China is contaminated with heavy metals, and the water table is being depleted, so we have to find other ways. This is a food technology project we're working on, we call City Farm, where we're testing aeroponics and hydroponics and different lighting arrays and sensors, automation, and we were able to produce enough food in about 2 weeks, about 30 days rather, to feed the media lab for lunch. That's actually hydroponics, that's aeroponics. We've now moved up to the 5th floor of the facade of our new building where we can do natural lighting control, and look at how this can be integrated into facades at scale in buildings and we're trying to see, that's the little jets firing for the aeroponics. So to see if we can do this, skin buildings with this very thin light layer that captures light, maybe serves the market down here, begin to deal with this just insane supply chain where food comes from all over the world. If we price carbon in terms of its true effect on society, this would not really be very practical. And so these are the metrics or the values we think we can get through this. Maybe 100 times the reduction per land area in a one-story array, 90% less water, 90% less CO2, 60% less fertilizer, grow food year-round, and make it highly visible in the community. We're also dealing with housing, not only housing, but co-working and shared space in general. Many mayors, Mayor of Shanghai, the Mayor of Bloomberg of New York, former Mayor of Boston, have said that housing is, affordable housing for young people is one of the great problems facing these cities where young people want to live, the 30, 40 innovation cities. So we're trying to do something about that. This was a little 300, I think it was a 300 square foot micro unit with a pull-out bed and tiny little table, almost no storage. We thought we could do a lot better. So we've been working on different strategies. In fact, did a spin-off company to commercialize some of this. So this is an apartment for Manhattan with the smallest kitchen and bathroom that is legal in New York City. Okay? In this case, you have a nice big living room. And then we have the bed that comes down, so a nice king-size bed, so a nice big bedroom. And then the dining table comes down, you can have a dining room for 10 people. So that was the concept. So then I, working with my PhD student, who's since graduated, Will here, who did the city car, we're developing this transformable technology now for apartments. So this is kind of a quick IKEA-like prototype, sort of the low end. And so we've made this work, and they've been living with this and his little family for a while. And then we made this work for a bed, so you can convert living room into a bed. And what we're trying, you can do these kind of things manually. You can have sofa beds and Murphy beds, but people can't live with that every day. I mean, in studies we've done, it's okay for a guest room, but you want this to just be magical. You want it to just, sort of go away. And in fact, you want it to be so cool when your friends come in, you say, watch this, and you just transform your apartment. This is this is a little video that we put out on the web 2 weeks ago. We've now had 600,000 views on YouTube. It's the most popular video to date at the Media Lab, where we said, let's go even smaller. This is a 200 square foot apartment that is designed as a piece of furniture that can go into really any space. So we convert from a living space to a dining space to a party space. The bathroom is actually very compact, but you can just move this whole unit out of the way, and then now you have a big handicap accessible apartment. We shot this in the Media Lab, by the way. This is on the 5th floor. He had quite a crowd around him. And you extend the size of your counter, and then you can load apps to do things like adjust lighting and blinds. And I was a little embarrassed when these guys did this, but I realized this is really for 20-somethings, and they were having a lot of fun, you know, kind of putting it, you know, into disco mode. But in this case, the point is you can. So you have these apps that you can download. So you can use the movement like that I would prefer, where you just touch it and it moves. Or you can use hand gestures and voice control or really anything. So it's really a laboratory to experiment with both the mechatronics of transformable space and the interface to engage with your home. These are the plans. You see it goes from living to big bathing, bed comes out for sleeping, then working, then dining, then cooking. So pretty simple. So I've been to many of these conferences, city-related conferences, where they tend to focus on the technology and the kind of the eco side of things. Smart city, eco-city, sustainable city, green city, low-carbon city, eco-smart city. There are a whole bunch of them that are hyphenated. And I think this is working backwards. I think you really want to start with people. And you want to start with the human interactions. And just to summarize, do I have 1 minute? Okay, I can do that. What we're trying to do in these cities is to find ways of increasing the density, the different types of density. You have social tie density. How broadly do you communicate with others? Residential density, employment density, density of all the third places like cafes, bars, hotels, etc. Then you want to increase the diversity, but not just population diversity, demographic diversity. You want to increase the density of the diversity of enterprises. So you have big companies, small companies, startups, research centers, nonprofits. You want to have housing diversity, so you can have working class people live with wealthy people, so you don't end up with Dubai, young professionals, elderly people. You want activity density, you know, places of living and playing and socializing and eating, etc. Then you can add all these new urban systems, of which I've mentioned a few that we care about, but there are lots of them that will help you manage that increased density and increase the connections between people in a proactive way. Then I think you need to do what this event here is doing, which is bring people together. So that can be festivals, it can be street fairs, hackathons, conferences. You know, that increases the social tie density and the connections. And that will lead to, we believe, increased innovation, and then you get the energy efficiency and more of the sustainable qualities almost by default. And I think if you do it right, you can have both simultaneously. You can make places better for people, and you can increase the resource efficiency simultaneously. Okay, thank you.
Hello, John Fernandez. Just as a reminder, I'm with MIT. I'm the head of the building technology program, and I'm a trained architect, and I've been doing work in cities now for about 7 years. I'm going to talk, it's actually really nice to talk just for 7 to 10 minutes. So I'm going to focus in on one kind of project that I do. It's called urban metabolism is the area. And urban metabolism simply refers to the resource requirements of cities. So the resource requirements of urban economies. It's timely to be talking to this group because we've started a project which is about, can you hear me all right? Is that a project that we've started about 7 months ago on the metabolism of the MIT campus. So I'll talk a little bit about that project. But I want to take you first through what I mean. So a lot of you, I fully suspected that Kent was going to go through the urban population growth and all that. So we know this, that the world is essentially more than 50% urban as of 2008 or so, and that's going to continue until about 65% or so, depending on whose numbers you believe. What we know less well, what is less popularly understood, is that our resource consumption went substantially from renewable materials to non-renewable materials somewhere in 1960. So we are now substantially a non-renewable consuming society. Much of this has to do with urbanization, the building of long-lived, durable things. Cities are the largest things that we build, that we make. So there's an enormous uptick in metals and minerals production. And you might want to say that that's also because of industrialization. Actually, it is in absolute numbers, but industry is the sector of our economy that has become most efficient, that has actually gained the greatest efficiencies over time versus transportation and the built environment. So industry is actually doing better than these other sectors, mostly because it makes money for industry, right? You make what you need, you produce a stream of revenue with less material. So the work that we do, this is a kind of a mind-numbing diagram, all right? This system boundary here is the urban economy. So everything that respires within the urban space we've captured here. Above this shaded rectangle are natural flows, the flora and fauna, and below is everything that we do. So the main drivers of resource consumption, this is the anthropogenic portion of the urban economy. And the main drivers are three things. So goods and services, the built environment and infrastructure, and transportation. What I'm really keen to, maybe we'll talk a little bit about this, is that campuses are city-like. They're neighborhood and district-like, but they're not detached from the larger city. So you still have these drivers in campuses and universities. And basically the work that we do is we account for the active inflows. So these activities are driving acquisition of resources and then the creation of wastes. So we've been doing this at city level. We've been doing it for Lisbon, Singapore. We've done a study in Boston, Los Angeles, on the overall aggregate resource consumption of those cities. So we can take it down to the resource intensity per capita in those cities. We've also been doing it for smaller scales. So now we're 80% into this project, which is the material legacy of the Back Bay. So this is asking the question from the founding of the Back Bay, what has been the material investment from the very beginning? What has been imported into the Back Bay? And then on a yearly basis, what is consumed in terms of materials, energy? Just to give you some figures, the cities in the world which are most resource efficient, per capita consumption of everything is something like 3 to 5 tons per capita. Cities in transition economies, like Lisbon, now Madrid, places like that, are 20 to 30 tons per capita. American cities are upwards of 60 to 80. Places like Singapore, anybody from Singapore? No? Okay, 100 tons per capita. Singapore is one of the now I'm talking about overall consumption of resources, energy, materials, and that, more than anything else, is correlated to wealth. So things the one thing that cities do best is create wealth. With wealth comes consumption. And there's very little decoupling around the world. Okay, so as I said, we've been doing this we're now into about the 7th month of the urban metabolism of the MIT campus. So again, this is simply asking the question, on a yearly basis, what comes into the MIT campus, how is it consumed, transformed, and then what leaves? It's, as you might imagine, a data nightmare, as these projects always are. At MIT, actually, I think we're a little bit fortunate. There are some very good data sources. And so things like building energy, campus energy use, are not that difficult to get to. We are using different vehicles for movement of different resources and understanding at different time scales. I don't really have time to go through this project in real detail, but simply to say the ultimate goal here is not just to know per capita, how much is consumed, but to transform what we know about resource consumption into activities or populations on the campus. So this is the resource intensity of one undergraduate year. If you're an undergraduate at MIT, there's a certain base consumption that even if you didn't eat anything, you never went to classes, you stayed in you would still be consuming a base of resources. And then after that, you make decisions about what you eat, how much you buy, the transportation. And so the goal here for this project is to get to a point where we can say, what's the resource intensity of 1 hour of lecture? What's the resource intensity of one researcher per year, one undergraduate, one graduate student? What's the resource intensity of the faculty, right? So that we can actually begin to label, assign the appropriate resource consumption to different populations, and then understand how that resource consumption can be reduced in a reasonable way that supports the mission of the university. Okay, I'm going to talk for 1 minute about a similar project. We have done a typology of urban resource consumption, a global typology. So this is asking the question, if you looked at hundreds of cities, do they consume resources in similar ways? Or is it just a smooth gradient from the most resource efficient to the least resource efficient? Kind of like Kent's diagram of Houston and Hong Kong. Is that a smooth curve? Or even in the diagram that Kent showed, even though it's just a diagram, is there clustering? Do you see groups? And the question we wanted to answer is, can we find typical profiles of urban resource consumption? Because if we can, those types of cities may have the same kinds of similar kinds of solutions applied to them versus another type of city. Let me explain the diagram. Actually, I didn't even explain the diagram. The diagram, so these are resources, 8 resources: biomass, fossil fuel, total energy, electricity, CO2 emissions, industrial metals and minerals, total materials and construction metals and minerals. This is low, medium, and high. So all the consumption figures are normalized to this graph. And when you do this, you get 15 different types. We have a second phase. And doing it very differently, we get 8 different types. So typologies are not scientific conclusions. You construct typologies. But I'm going to show you this one. So the most resource efficient cities are sometimes the least humane. They're resource efficient because they do not serve their populations adequately, right? The most resource intensive are, the usual suspects. In between, there's some interesting, so when you think about this, there may be some interesting sweet spots, urban sweet spots. Somewhere in here, there are some really good models for where the population has been being well served, the economy is very, relatively healthy, and the prospects for the future are good, and they're resource efficient. It's interesting. I just want to say one point about this. So here's my proposal to you. Wouldn't it be interesting to do a typology of campuses, resource consumption on campuses? What are the different types? Are they related to, are they purely based, is their resource consumption purely based on where they are, what country they are? Are they based on top tier, second tier, third tier university? What are the drivers behind resource consumption at universities? Just to give you one point about this typology, there's only one type that is composed solely of cities in one country, and that is Japanese cities. And Japanese cities are very they're different from any other cities. And we tried really hard to push them into another type, and it just wouldn't happen. This is all done through statistical clustering. And Japanese cities are quite efficient in biomass, food, total energy is they're quite efficient. Electricity is quite high, fossil fuels medium, but they're very, very high consuming in metals and minerals, primarily because it's a highly industrialized economy, but very frugal culture. So the combination there is kind of interesting. So I'm going to leave it at that. I'm sure we'll have time for questions. Thank you.
And I was quite impressed with this, and we have the ex-mayor here, with this compact that has been signed about a year back, roughly May, I think, as an example of a community, and I think these excellent presentations of the urban and the model that perhaps John mentioned, if we could look at in terms of metabolism, where universities within, I guess, the larger scheme of things can play an example. So this, I think, was very, very interesting. But today I wanted to maybe mention, and unfortunately I don't have a PowerPoint, so please bear with me, or you can look at these wonderful pictures. Is give you an overview of some global discussions. And there's a lot of things happening, especially from the UN, where I am based. And I think in the room here from Africa, besides me, there's one more colleague. Anyone else? Okay. Yeah, so I think that side, in terms of a lot of growth, a lot of development happening as part of this planet, yeah, and how can we be part of these discussions? So within, and just to mention that, you know, we had this big conference, Rio +20, and most of us are in the environment sustainability side of things, where we had 50,000 people in Rio to look at what has worked, what hasn't worked, and is there a future that we want? Yeah, so this actually came together. But at that, we did an analysis of 50 conventions. There are globally 500 different environment-related conventions. For example, climate change is one. We have biodiversity. We have a whole load of conventions. And we analyzed only 90 of these 500 global conventions, including climate change, biodiversity. And it was very sobering to us that 20 years after Rio, there is significant progress in only 4 out of these 90. Yeah? So we're more talkers than walkers, as the Sloan sort of study. So this whole issue of doing and talking more and not delivering, I think is very much impacting this whole delivery of the global sort of climate scenario. So within this, I think, and it was a sobering fact that we've produced all the PhDs, all the MBAs, and yet the statistics are all going down, yeah? In terms of consumption, in terms of climate change. And we had this very interesting conference in London. This is called Planetary Boundaries. Yeah? Just before Rio, I'm not sure if some of you were there. Again, there's the Earth Futures Forum, a lot of stuff happening along this resilience and planetary boundaries. And we're slowly approaching, if not trespassing, on some of these so-called tipping points. So with this, I think, and climate change is one of many, and it's very good to read in the news today about the US position, 30%, so on and so forth. But then there are a lot of big challenges. We had the head of the Climate Change Convention here in Boston last week, and we have a big summit coming up in Peru in December this year, and hopefully there's a lot of discussion. We have a protocol that will replace Kyoto next year in Paris. Yeah? So the discussions are there, $100 billion per year pledged for climate change through this new green climate fund and a secretariat established in Korea. So like this, we have a couple of these areas, ecosystems management, we have disasters, we have waste. So there are a whole of these issues globally that are happening. But at the moment, I wanted to also mention that there is some interesting negotiations going on in New York, looking at the Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, so something to replace the MDGs. So in this context, education has been identified as one of 16 areas. So I guess as universities, and this is where I think the role of universities has not been highlighted as much as it could in these global discussions. So with, I guess, Rio Plus 20, and JC is here in the room, we had the largest number of voluntary commitments at Rio Plus 20, which Ban Ki-moon, in fact, acknowledged, nearly 300 commitments from universities in terms of sustainability. So I think there are movements happening, but how we bring that together and how do we make sure universities are part of this larger discussion is a huge challenge for us. Yeah? And this is where, in terms of scalability, I wanted to emphasize 3 key points. First is in terms of the relevance. Yeah? Are what we're doing in universities relevant? And we saw some excellent examples from Kent and John on the urban side. Yeah? Are we part of the global discussions? We've been talking green economy. Is there a course in any of the universities on green economy? So like that, in terms of some discussions around that, in terms of policy, in terms of even spill out to communities, I think that side of things. So that's one. There was an interesting aspect pointed out by our colleagues at Harvard about eco-regional. How can we be part of the local community looking at specific issues? I think that was something very interesting. But then the second part, which I also wanted to mention, is something about mainstreaming. Because environment somehow is always, can it be a little bit more mainstreamed within the larger context of things? And here, of course, campus is one of the aspects, but then we have curriculum, we have community, and also we have the engagement of students, which is most important. And I think several of us yesterday have highlighted this in terms of students and mainstreaming and building their capacity. The last and most important part I wanted to emphasize is this issue of networking. And globally, it's becoming a smaller world, you know. We can, with an email, anything, you're connected, as you saw in that, even with tweets and who's tweeting from where. But in a connected world, how are things happening? And especially in Africa, where I am based in Nairobi, we see a lot of universities, a lot of growth, and a lot of hope and aspiration. Yeah? Yes, there are all these issues of development, poverty, but how do we bring that together? And this is where, in terms of networks, at the moment in Kenya, they've just established a Kenya Green University Network, looking at the basic fundamental steps, you know, of green campus, curriculum, so on and so forth. So how can we scale this up? Africa, Asia Pacific, again, a huge continent. We have excellent examples from Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand. But how can we bring it together in terms of the regional context? We have the ASEAN group. Again, they will be a community by 2015. How does this sort of mainstream in terms of those discussions? And also in terms of, I guess, looking forward to other regions. For example, Latin America, a huge network of 200 universities, ARIUSA, and collaborating with Spain, yeah, with Javi. So like that, I think there are a lot of examples on networking between universities, and this is where I think ISCN, in terms of scalability of issues, and that's why with Bernd, I think with UNEP, we are very interested to explore this partnership, because we have a similar network, which is called the Global Universities Partnership, where we're looking not just at sort of exclusive universities, but rather broader, and trying to share this message and learning from good examples, yeah, whether it's at different levels. But then the final thing I wanted to mention is that this year is the end of this UN Decade of Education for Sustainable Development. You've heard of this? Okay, good, at least. So we, at the moment, will be launching in Nagoya this November a global action program on education for sustainable development. And one of the pillars of the so-called 5 areas is a whole institution approach. And we want very much to highlight some of these examples that have come out at the conference in Nagoya, whether it's on the testing side, the metrics with sustainable literacy tests, whether it's on the campus side, whether it's on the community side, so on and so forth. But then in terms of, I guess, moving forward, I just wanted to re-emphasize in terms of my 10 minutes to say that from a global perspective, lots of things happening, but as universities, can we be relevant? Can we be part of these sort of policy discussions, links with community, like the example here? Can we also mainstream our activities, yeah, so that students, community, so on and so forth. And finally, I think the power of networks in scaling things up. Thank you.
I like what Mahesh was saying earlier, those 3 points. The first one, if we don't get the relevancy right, then everything that we're doing is not going to matter that much in the long run. So we have to be relevant. And we have to be relevant on our campuses first to make sure that we're doing the right things so that people would be interested in scaling up, or we'd have the capacity to scale up. So we also had a great opportunity to kind of talk about this in advance yesterday. So I put a couple of slides together, and then we had a workshop, pre-conference workshop yesterday, and then we talked about this a little bit more. So I was able to add some new thinking into what we're going to talk about this morning. But I'm going to start with two main questions, which is, if we're thinking about scalability as our topic for this morning, then the first question is, what does scalability mean within the context of our universities? We already know that from the intellectual side and the knowledge base, we have great people, and you saw great examples of that this morning, of people who are thinking outside the box and coming up with creative solutions. But then inside the campus itself, inside of our walls, what are we doing and what are some of our options? And secondly, what are the actions that we can take specifically? What are some things that universities can do to accelerate? So I'm going to kind of use accelerate and scale up kind of interchangeably because I think in some ways they're very similar. So the first question is, what does scalability mean in a college campus? So from the workshop yesterday, we came up with, there was some good ideas that were passed on. And the first thing that we discovered was that there's a number of things that we should recognize that scaling just simply won't work. There's certain shapes and sizes of things that work very well at their appropriate size. And it is folly to try to make them bigger or to expand them. Some things are just perfect the way they are. And so it's really not about scaling up. It's really about maximizing or optimizing. Secondly, we talked about replicating the success of some of the projects we're working on, but to continue to improve. So, for example, this is the Philip Merrill Center in Annapolis, Maryland. This is where the Chesapeake Bay Foundation headquarters is. And this was the very first LEED Platinum building. It's a remarkable building, and it was done over a decade ago when everyone was still thinking about this. But they were the first ones to actually implement all of these. And they went through a lot of growing pains, obviously, to do this. Well, today, it's a lot easier. It's never easy to make a LEED Platinum building, but it's a lot easier because there were pioneers in the field that kind of broke the mold. But what that also means is that we don't have to stay steady with this and say this is the platinum standard, and we can continue to improve on how do we make these things better. So scaling also means refining. It's not just making things bigger or faster. It also means just making them more refined. And another insight that came out yesterday, which I thought was very interesting, was that the hands-on learning is not necessarily possible to scale up. Now, we can do more of it. We can increase the number of people and the number of projects that we're working on. But essentially, the one-on-one, face-to-face interaction is not something that you can just create a bigger pool for. That same kind of the value of that one-on-one interaction still needs to be maintained. So that leads us to question 2, which is, what are specific actions that universities can take to scale up these solutions? So what I'm going to suggest today, and I hope that this will lead to some more conversations as we get into the panels, is I think that there's really three ideas that we should probably explore a little bit more in depth as sustainability practitioners as we think about the role of our universities and our offices as we're going forward. So the first one is the demonstration aspect of how we're doing things at the university. The second thing is the targeted analysis. And the third is facilitation. These are three things that I think that uniquely we do well at the university, that we can scale up and that we can make a bigger impact as we go forward. So let me take these one by one. So from a demonstration perspective, what I would say is that one thing that we can do, and I think a lot of us are doing, we had all these conversations about going to the next generation. And what that means is that we're rethinking kind of the way that we have gone from dealing with sustainability on campus to the way that we want to go. And so that is a form of scaling up. So kind of maturing, going into kind of an adult mode for the sustainability. So what it means is that in the past, when we had students where the drivers have changed, they were the ones knocking on the door and saying, we need to do more. You know, the next step, scaling up, means taking them and starting to incorporate them into the way that we actually do our business. In the past, many of our universities were quite good at using our resources. But going forward, scaling up means taking those resources and actually embedding them and allocating them according to our targets and goals. So now we're actually setting the targets first, and then we're allocating the resources. In the past, we had steady incremental progress. Where we want to go if we scale up is transformation. In the past, we've been very opportunistic. We find ideas and opportunities, they kind of fall in our lap, and we grab them. We're very good at being opportunistic. But the scaling up means that we're going to be more strategic. And then finally, we've been quite good at trying to find ways to fit things in, fit them where they are. There's a little gap in the door, we put our foot in, and then we jump in. But the next step in scaling would be to actually build these into our policies and practices and standards. The second thing is the second big idea, I think, is the targeted analysis. And I think this is something that we can do quite well. It's an easy transition in some ways. We've been talking a lot about using our campuses as a living laboratory. In other words, what that means to me is that we take a real world problem, we have students work on them in collaboration with our office as the bridge to a faculty member or more. And so that's an easy transition to make because there are already many faculty members who are doing work and they have graduate students, and it's just a connection point to try to get them more focusing on either projects that are on our campus or in our neighborhoods or in our cities. And so for example, here was a project where the marketing professor and his PhD student were very interested in looking at different ways of creating signs to see if they would have different impacts on recycling or on behaviors. And so we said, well, if you're going to look at behavior, why not look at recycling behavior? That would help us, it would help you. And so, of course, that was what we were able to do. And we were able to take these kinds of projects and the goal for any of these kinds of projects is to get the results and not only use them for ourselves, but then to distribute them. And that's where the scaling part comes in. So the results can go back out to the city, they can go to other universities we can share, and then that scaling takes place. And then finally, the stakeholder process. I think the facilitation, one thing that we do very well as universities is we hold meetings, we have stakeholder engagement. Now, a number of people can do this. The private sector can do this, but they have a vested interest in the outcome. The government can do this, but the government also has an agenda at play. And consultants can hold facilitation and stakeholder consensus building forums, but of course they're simply getting paid to do what the client wants. But universities are uniquely positioned because we are respected in the field. And we do this all the time. We know that the stakeholder-driven process is the best chance of producing optimal results and incorporating stakeholder buy-in and avoiding or mitigating conflicts. So we can do a lot more of this. We can actually take the lead and look for the projects or the problems that are happening within our communities and our cities and take that role. And that's something that is scalable. And that's it. I look forward to your discussion afterwards. Thank you.
I'd like to start with something Mahesh referred to, at least my take on it, is when I go around the world and I talk to people and organizations that are thinking about all these issues related to sustainability. I get a little frustrated because there's a lot of talk, and organizations seem to be continuously reinventing the wheel, starting from scratch, and not learning from innovation that might be happening in other places. How can we do a better job in capturing and disseminating in detail, not just high level, but in detail, what works and what doesn't work related to the kind of innovation that we need, design, technology, and public policy?
It would be interesting to see how universities can be that incubator and sort of knowledge repository where we capture the information and then move on and build on from there. And also in terms of knowledge, I guess, in terms of linking up with the community and often in the case, your example, with the urban sort of governments, urban, I think that side of things also was something that maybe we need to look at, where universities have that link into the broader segments of society.
John, can you imagine a kind of a Wikipedia, in other words, a bottom-up process of capturing this kind of information and archiving it and refining it, or do you have
That's a good
other
idea.
strategy? Okay.
So yeah, absolutely. I think so. There are a couple of different points that I want to make here, though. Actually, I want to ask a question. Does that exist in your network? How do you share? Do you share information in a formal way, aside from, and what's the form of that sharing?
Actually, that's a good idea. Show of hands if people feel like there is such a network that exists to capture these ideas.
So is it mostly working on individual basis? You know each other and you email each other and you communicate that way, or Kent just brought up the idea of a Wikipedia. So is it that, or is there?
So if you take ASHE in the U.S., so that's our national organization, they have forums on different topics, and you could potentially go and look at all the composting systems, and, but they're all. But that's not necessarily what we do. I think there's a lot more informal networking that occurs, a lot more reaching out to individuals, and people can feel free to disagree.
Yes, sir.
What we have as a network is, and the members know that, the charter has a charter reporting under it. And this is like in the 3 principles, we've got each principle has like 10 buckets where stuff goes in. This is a placeholder for people to give minimal information on case studies and performance. This is the basis then for us and your colleagues. You look for the charter reports, you see you've got a great case study on water savings in arid region, and then you go and ask for more information. You want to improve that over time, you want to make it searchable, you want to have more downloadable functions. We'd love to work with all of you on that. But the basis as a charter reporting is part of our organization.
Well, that would be a fantastic project to actually evaluate the state of the art of these systems for capturing and sharing information, and then to systematically figure out how to make it more scalable.
I guess the one point I wanted to make was that, so a couple different examples. Back 20 years ago, maybe 30 years ago, people were talking about green buildings as a sort of generic thing, a generic type. And there wasn't, at the beginning of the green building discussion, there wasn't as much of an awareness of how a residential building is different from a commercial building, is different from an industrial building. Now we know very well that they're completely different animals, and that you would absolutely not do the same thing for an industrial building to reduce its overall resource consumption that you would do for a residential building. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that I agree with Kent. We're talking about green or sustainable or eco-cities in a sort of very generic sense, not necessarily reconciling what are the really key challenges for cities in their particular location, their governance structure, their human development index, all sorts of other issues. And it would seem to me that, again, we're sort of moving into maybe a more nuanced conversation about how different cities or different city types are. And this just goes back to what I was saying before are different, and so how it would be appropriate to target like cities in a similar way. And so I think that would be my one question to the Wikipedia, absolutely. But I suspect that Ivy League universities and that tier are very different from community colleges in the way that they, so for example, I suspect that transportation energy at community colleges for the residents, for the student population is much, much higher. I mean, I think that's obvious, right? That's an easy one. And so what do you do in that situation when you have very high transportation? So the overall resource consumption of a community college is very different from an Ivy League school. So I think that's where I would go with information sources. And certainly sharing information, but at some point aspiring to sharing it in a structured hierarchical way, so that you can place your own priorities within.
Actually, David, I'd like to build on something you mentioned about the university as a living lab, which is something we've been thinking quite a bit about. And universities are interesting places because they have their own budget. They're very top-down, so decision-making is a little more streamlined usually, until you get faculty involved. And they tend to be in a very constrained, geographic area, and you have a lot of creative people and young people. But why? Do you agree that maybe a university is an ideal living laboratory to test these kind of innovations? And if so, what are the big things that we should start with?
Well, yeah. So I would not say that it's an ideal situation because there are a number of challenges that are in place, but it's a great opportunity. I'd say that.
Okay.
And I think that it's very similar to what the conversation of comparing cities. All the universities are so completely different. They're so unique. And we've actually had some experience in trying to compare the Ivy League schools, and they don't compare very well, quite honestly. Just because each one is so intensely different. And they're different in their location, they're different in their climate, they're different in their research intensity. And there's so many different factors, and you realize that there's a lot of personality that works in, and there's a certain person in one school that happens to be a driver in a very good spot and can really create a change. So, and with that in mind, kind of transferring that back to, what are the advantages of the university, you can get to the learning lab kind of situation at the university because there are some pieces in place. But let me just point out one thing that I think is important when it comes to living lab, and I think that a lot of us have come across this, which is that there are some incentives that are misplaced to be able to make that connection. So, for example, if we have at MIT or at Hong Kong University or Johns Hopkins, where I was before, you need a handshake between the faculty and the students and some kind of intermediary, which is typically our office. Faculty members don't often have the incentive. So if you're a junior faculty member, you may have pressure to be producing, and you may not get the support of your department chair to be playing around on the campus with students when you have your own research to do. If you're a senior faculty member, you may have other obligations. You may be running a lab. You may be doing all kinds of other stuff, and so your obligation is really going to be to your to your lab. Right? So there are some structural issues that sometimes can make it very difficult. Now, in a perfect world, when everything aligns, then you can find that those wonderful opportunities where the researcher is really looking at one thing and it happens to kind of sandwich between what we're looking for as well, and we can kind of make that happen. But
Do either of you guys have thoughts on what would make a more ideal living laboratory?
So very quickly, so when we started the typology work in cities about 5 years ago, we heard from several cities exactly what you just said about campuses. We're unique. We're not like any other city. And it's true. Every city is unique. Every city is also the same. Because every city has, so if you look at it in terms of urban economics, every city has this, they're doing the same things, doing it in very different ways and all of that. So I guess my I think as a laboratory, I think each individual university, absolutely, you made a very good point about how test beds, right, demonstration projects, bringing that into the research culture and facilitating, absolutely. I think that makes a lot of sense, and I think you're essentially doing that at MIT. But I would also really advocate for thinking very, very, very broadly and globally about how Indonesian universities, Thai universities are the same or different from Northern American, Northern European universities. Because as a global collective, I think what we can do is we can say, well, you know, there are lessons learned about simply accepting lower consumption. Like simply, so that there's an uncomfortable conversation to be had at the society level and at the urban level about, well, you know, some of the real returns eventually are going to be that people are just going to reconcile themselves to live with less. And are there really good examples at Indian universities, Latin American universities, where not every space has to be air conditioned, not every space has to have the super amenities that you know, North American students expect? Maybe those are interesting things to look at. Anyway,
You know, we're at the Media Lab, which is in the School of Architecture and Planning, but we also have 80 big corporate sponsors. And I have been struck over and over again by this cultural difference. In the world of architecture and planning, there tends to be this idea that every problem is unique and we have to bring a whole bunch of experts together and go through this intensive process to find a singular optimized solution because cultural values and geography and everything else is, you know, is like, say, unique. Industry tends to come at it from the other point of view, that we can come up with a set of tools and modular components that could be, maybe combined in unique ways, but that can rapidly scale because everybody has to basically do the same thing these days in cities. They work the similar ways. They drive the same cars. They use the same cell phones. They use the same communication networks, et cetera. So you have these extremes. So where do you come down on that?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's and they're both right, you know, to a certain extent. At the university level, I think that there's a couple of things that we could see definitely work. You know, in terms of repositories, you know, those things are quite good, but quite often what we see with case studies is you read or you hear about something that's working very well at another university, and then you realize there's some very unique factors that just for whatever reason wouldn't allow it to work at your university, or perhaps you'd end up with a different outcome. But at the same time, there are some things that probably do translate, and those are the areas that we could probably focus on. So one of the things that I think that one of the problems that we've had that we need to recognize is that we've been very technology driven. We've been focused on what is it that we need to install in our buildings that's going to help us reduce our energy, or what's that technological fix that's going to, you know, create less water consumption and so forth. Whereas really the role that we have as sustainability professionals primarily is about communications. And so when we get distracted by the technologies, we're missing the communication side. And the communication side, I think, is something that could transfer from one campus to the next. You know, how are we messaging certain things? How are we trying to make those connections? How are we looking at kind of the social factors and the use of social media and other ways that really work? And so, you know, a good outreach campaign that is rooted in a good marketing structure that works at one place could probably be, you know, tailored to work quite well somewhere else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, maybe to build on this, and because of the cultural diversity, the issues being so different, we're trying to get a sense one time of how many universities are there globally. And this is a moving target. So ultimately, the figures we got were there's 16,000 universities globally, with 200 million going through the system every year. So in terms of the numbers, you know, the sheer size and the scale and variety, and how do we pitch it in a way that it becomes useful? Okay? So in terms of the high-tech interventions to the very low-tech, and we have universities that are out in the fields. So I think that's where, in terms of a toolkit on these approaches. And I know from ISCN there are these case studies that you've also compiled, and I think we wish to build on that. So last year in Morocco, we launched a toolkit on greening of universities. Something from very basic, like a practical, so in terms of your carbon footprint, your use of resources, as you mentioned, and how do we move further from there. And we're planning later this year in Nagoya to try to put this toolkit again with additional case studies so that universities across the globe can look at different interventions, because not, I think, one fits the other, yes, as Davis mentioned. So the whole idea is of case studies and then adapting it to their local context would be, I think, the way to go.
I'd like to radicalize the conversation a little bit, because here's one thing. You know, when you think about sustainable society, there's like the conversation about how to make things more efficient, and then there's the conversation about, boy, we are so not sustainable, and we're so far from getting there. There needs to be radical paradigm shift and all of that, right? Where we are with cities now is there's the beginnings of the understanding that it's not so useful to talk. So the point you made is absolutely what I wanted to focus on is the technological fixes are basically business as usual, just more resource efficient, right? Really, what we should be thinking about is let's abstract the problem just a little bit. Universities provide a service. What's that service? Education. So what's the resource intensity of that unit of service, right? So you can really begin to, all of the hype and the discussion, rhetoric, and some really substantial conversation about MOOCs is really relevant here. Because if I can deliver a unit of education dematerialized, decoupled from air conditioning and lighting and all that, isn't that a really good thing, right? And so I think and I know sometimes as directors of sustainabilities in your different universities, where you sit and what the power structure is and all that, you know, it's not, maybe not entirely within the conversation always to, you know, question the mission of the university, how you're delivering the service.
We would never do that.
But I would say that there are some really interesting parallels and maybe some complementary discussions that can be had, because there's a lot of interest in online education, you know, delivering education in a different way. The project base is high value, high resource intense. So there's a population which you need to target and say, those are the people we're going to deliver problem-based learning, hands-on learning. But I would radicalize. I would say, let's go back to what are the units of services? What are the unit of services, different services to different populations that you're delivering, and to think about it that way.
Can I, if you don't mind, if I could just follow on, because you actually you jumped on something that I was just going to ask as well, which is, you know, the question from a sustainability point of view is what does the university look like 100 years from now or 50 years from now? And I can say one thing, that the universities, it's not going to look like this. Okay, I mean, look out into the crowd. You see, you know, cell phones. You see iPads. You see computers. You see people checking their messages. You see people talking. This is, you know, this is no offense, Julie, but this is not the best way. This is not the best way to be engaging ourselves. And we know that this is really what the last century looked like. This is not what the next century looks like. And the next century probably does have a lot more online. It probably has a lot more interactive. It's the kinds of conversations that we have are not going to be a couple of people sitting up in the front and talking at, you know, I mean, there's way too many people there and too few people here. This is not a dialogue, right? And if you don't have a dialogue, then that means you have more people kind of starting to zone out. You have people checking their messages. There's too many distractions. And I think that one of the things universities have to grapple with is that the traditional way of kind of lecturing to a large group of students, those days are numbered. I just don't think that that's going to be viable for very much longer. Our attention spans are just not that long anymore.
I think in many places, it's actually, the transition's already happened.
Yeah.
I was just in Finland, and I met with the education minister there, who was through MIT about a month ago, meeting with us. And they are moving rapidly to not doing teaching in the classroom, teaching will all happen online with videos and lecture notes, et cetera. That the classroom will all be experiential. It'll be about applying the knowledge. And I think that's where the Media Lab ended up 20 years ago, basically. The Media Lab does not do education. It does learning through doing. And I think that really understanding that and separating those two things. So if you can do education in a distributed way at very low cost, low energy cost, et cetera, that will happen. It's happening right now. This kind of, I think, yeah, this is conceived as one-way transfer of knowledge, this room design. Hopefully it's more than that because we're going to start opening it up. But these things are so important when people come together and they solve problems together and they share ideas that we can't do without that.
Well, one very quick note. So knowing Julie, she's probably taking really detailed notes of the conversation. But actually, I did want to say that I have a slightly different view. I agree. We won't have as much of this, but it seems to me that it's the easiest thing and the hardest thing to predict the future. Easiest thing because we won't be here in 40 years talking about this. But the fact is that I think what's going to happen is that there will always be classrooms. There will always be this sort of lecture, and but there will also be a whole set of other things. And the question that I would like to raise is, if a university measures its sustainability by the resource intensity of the volume of education that it delivers, however you want to measure that, are there ways to become sustainable that we haven't really talked so much about because we're really thinking in the traditional sense of the bricks and mortar university buildings. And sometimes the technological fixes are just fine. We know how to make this building net zero energy. It's far from it, I'm sure, but I'm sure you could do it. So I think that's the larger, broader conversation. I think
Go ahead.
Yeah, just on the MOOC side of things, I think it's so important, valuable that it reaches out beyond borders. I can sit in Bangladesh and listen to a Harvard edX MOOC. So that power of transforming beyond sort of geographic regions is huge.
Right.
And many in the developing world, I think, need to also look at these linkages and empowering. I think that's important.
Yep. I want to switch gears a little bit, just ask each of you a personal question.
it's a lot of answers.
If you come at it. So I think all of us, in the end, want to make a difference in the world. I think that's what motivates us. Can you and you can't, and we won't make any difference in the world unless our ideas scale, if we get them out there. And can you each identify one thing you're working on you think has the potential of scaling, and what would be the process of seeing that go to scale?
Okay, all right, so the way I save the world in
Exactly.
1 minute or less. I think that we've been having a lot of these conversations about 2.0, right, which is really starting to promote the mindset of getting out of the traditional thinking. And I think you're right. A lot of the thinking is, this is what we do. Let's find something that makes it, instead of this much impact, let's make it this much impact. And a lot of the things that we're looking at do that. And we're usually satisfied with that. And I think that we need to, when I'm in the classroom, sometimes I'll put up a picture of, Starbucks had this whole campaign of these coffee cups, and it says, 10% recycled content. This saved, 50,000 trees over the last year. And it doesn't take a lot of math to say, well, if 10% is 50,000 trees, then 90% is, is a whole lot more. So, and we have to get people thinking about that. It's not the 10% reduction; it's the other 90% that's still on the table. Yeah. And I think that in our own little way, that's probably what we're trying to get people to think of. There's certain kinds of sustainability principles I think that we all have been playing around with and we've been thinking about in terms of integration and kind of a systems approach and focusing on humans. I think that you made a great point about that. I mean, start with the human experience first, because the fact is things like climate change really affect humans more than, and the Earth will be okay, but we don't know how to live in a much changed climate.
So you're saying for you taking it to scale is through the students that then go out into the world and
Well, it's
continue
not
to
just in
explore
the
these.
students. We have the opportunity to engage people in the community as well.
Okay.
And so, as universities, quite often we have people from the government coming to ask us their opinion, or they ask us to join their panels, and that's a role that I think that we should take. But yeah, the combination of basically trying to be advocates of a new way of thinking about problem solving, which is not just kind of making things less bad, but actually transforming them into something different.
Mahesh, you?
Yeah, I would like to take a slightly different view in the sense that in the UN, and maybe personally, we see a lot of these so-called decision makers. We see the leaders, they come, they make their statements, there's a lot of negotiations taking place. And I really find that in terms of the whole academic sector, it's a big missing sort of link. Because yes, as Davis mentioned, the governments come ask universities for advice, so on and so forth. But then when it comes to the decisions that are taking place, the universities are far away from the picture. So somehow my personal thing is to make that gap smaller, so that the universities are valued in the process, decisions are based on science, we have the future Earth, and in the process, I guess, we move towards more sustainability. And this is the environmental education push and maybe sustainability education. And that whole thing comes back to this relevance issue of universities, because we say, oh, they're in their ivory towers doing their experiments and their toys and so on and so forth. But to make it ground and reality-based in terms of solutions and making our decision makers part of that process.
So, I mean, you won't be surprised, I guess, so acquiring data, making it available, making it an explicit mission of the Sustainability Office to acquire data for resource consumption, and making it available so that if somebody wants to know very quickly what is the resource intensity of being a student at a university, and how does that compare to being a resident of Cambridge? And is the university better or worse than Cambridge itself? And I suspect, I think Davis, you brought it up, and others, the university has an extraordinary opportunity to be a model for really the best, cutting edge, most progressive vision on sustainability. We don't really even know that. I mean, and we can wear as many green T-shirts as we want, and we won't really know if we're actually doing better than a city. If we are doing better, then the mission of universities would be to be models for neighborhoods, and then I think we've got something going. The fact that there's an enormous amount of discussion and interest and activity in the developed North on sustainability. There's some, but when you look at the urban population, very, very little in the global South. And I would suspect that the most resource-efficient campuses in the world are the developing world. They're resource efficient because they don't have air conditioning, they don't do the sorts of things, they just simply don't have the sorts of amenities. And the question for me would be, so what should a university provide? Should a university really provide an Olympic-sized pool with a fitness center to die for that's air-conditioned 24/7? Because really that's to be competitive to attract students. Maybe that's always going to be the reality in this country and in others where you're going after a very small population of students. But I think we really need to talk about the other huge population of students that are being underserved or need to be served better, and what does resource intensity look like in those?
And I would just say, to your point that the university is not a complete community to explore these ideas, we've been, with our initiative, trying to have a relationship with a city in Asia. We just did a workshop in Quito. In Northern Europe, it's the Hafen city in Hamburg. In the Middle East, it's the new development that Imar is doing in Dubai. In Iskandar in Asia, et cetera. And we try to have a local university as part of a district, just like MIT is part of Kendall Square. I don't think it would be interesting to do MIT as a living laboratory it's interesting to do MIT plus Kendall Square as a living laboratory, and there I think we can actually get somewhere. Yes, ma'am.
Where does learning take place? What's a good learning environment if we look at learning in diverse populations? And what we're trying to do is we try to basically send, as part of a certificate in sustainability and social innovation, send students out with some experts and stage social learning processes in municipalities so that really it doesn't take place in the classroom. So we save energy as well. But it's emotionally energy intensive, of course, these things, and they're very hard to scale because you need a few individuals and it takes specific skill sets. But so that would be my input. What do you think about that? Are change processes under-researched? And so if we think in terms of having MOOCs and with specific sets of analytic courses that you can do at home, and on the other hand, we have face-to-face problem-based learning with the nitty-gritty of transformational change and value conflicts that you have to solve, and it gets tough and people disagree. So how can we document that as a database? And I just think in terms of Wiki is a great idea because Wiki makes transparent how the knowledge was created and the knowledge creation process. So how can we better document our processes and things that have failed and value conflicts and tensions, and that we will face them all, rather than a nice glossy story of, oh yeah, this technology has served us nicely.
Well, I would just bring it up again. I would refer you to what's going on in Finland, which, by the way, they have the highest rated public education system in the world. And we're now working with them to put a junior high and high school classrooms in the middle of Aalto campus where the students share resources with the university students so they can use the fab lab and the chemistry lab and they do their homework in a co-working facility, et cetera.
My name is Angelo Riccaboni. I'm director of the University of Siena in Italy. I'm a part of the Leadership Council of the Sustainable Development Solutions Network mentioned by Mahesh. I'm sure we all agree that humanity is in front of big challenges and universities can play a role. But I think that we have a very important window in front of us, which is the window mentioned by Mahesh of the debate on sustainable development goals. So it's something that we should work more on, especially because now the feeling is that universities are not considered at the center of this debate, and they are not considered able to give a contribution to the new Sustainable Development Goals. So I would invite ISCN to also work on it and to prepare something for the Goya conference, because I'm sure that other organizations will work on it, saying that, no, universities, higher education can play a role. And this network, I'm just arrived, but it's a very good network, could give a contribution on this direction. So don't lose this opportunity. Also because the issue of giving a contribution to sustainable development, to sustainability, is important also for the social role of universities. Because here we have very important universities, maybe they don't have financial constraints, but all over the world, financial constraints are very important for universities. So in order to be legitimized, in order to have social role, if they give a contribution to the big challenges, they will find, again, a social role. So I think it's important for many reasons, this effort.
No, well, I agree. The last part especially is really interesting to us because we've got two directions that are happening at the universities. One is this migration towards online learning and MOOCs and things like that, which separate the students from the actual physical university. And at the same time, on the university, we're moving so strongly towards group learning and group work and group. So on one hand, we recognize the value of that social component, that there's something very unique about the university that embraces or that requires that social interaction. But then we're also kind of splitting and thinking about the online, which is completely removing the social, the social compact as well. So it's going to be interesting to see how we marry those back together at some point.
Yeah, I think this, in fact, is being negotiated and it'll be ready before September, the General Assembly. Because at the moment, we had the MDGs, 10, and the difference this time with the SDGs, it's universal, whereas the MDGs were more for developing countries. Yeah? So this time, across the board, it will be applicable in the sense of aspirational targets. So it's been negotiated, they've brought it down to 16 areas, but again, by September, hopefully, there will be a negotiated sort of goals. But in Nagoya, which is November, later, after the SDGs, is that we have a world conference on education for sustainable development. And this is where I invite all the universities here, and we'll work through Bern to see how ISCN can join us in this process. Yes, I take on your comments. Yeah.
Should we go? Yes, ma'am.
I'm Henrietta Davis. I'm the aforementioned former mayor of the city of Cambridge. And I just want to say that as a city, we want to be a living laboratory. We also see that as a way of transforming all that you're learning at the university level to the municipal level. Myself, I see that as an issue across the world, that you're doing so much of the work that needs to come out of your small city-states, which many of you have, and into our larger cities in a grander way. There are a couple of examples I think that are really terrific. One is the solar map that was developed at Harvard, then by Christoph Reinhardt, and then he moved to MIT, so you can claim it as both the Harvard and MIT product. And it's now become a part of what the city does to promote solar development, and it's also being used across the state by others to use that. Another is a project by Harvey Michaels, who works on energy efficiency. His group of students proposed to NSTAR, our utility, a model for getting multifamily housing, which is very difficult to get to be energy efficient, to get that to work in a systemic fashion. So the city partnered with MIT and partnered with the utility, and now we have an MOU that started in the beginning from MIT saying multifamily. Am I causing that? It is alarming, I know. But true. So we want it, and I think I speak for other cities too. We want you to come out into our cities. I think the missing link is you need a link. You need a kind of a hub. You need a matchmaking service, and I think that's what we're hoping that our compact will help to do that, to create that kind of matchmaking possibility. But you could see it happening globally. It doesn't need to be even local. That somehow if there's a ISCN hub, and so I'm looking for a city that wants whatever. Bloomberg is doing it with the foundation, doing that kind of matchmaking, and I think that's something you need to look to. So carry on, yes, and do use the cities as living laboratories.
Sorry. Thank you. When students can be exposed to the many stakeholders involved in that process, right, they need to understand how a mayor has to think about these issues and some of the problem solving that the regulators and the mayors and the other volunteer groups go through. That's when the lesson can be very powerful for students, and then it scales. And I would suggest that water is the key opportunity to focus on, because you can problem solve at a very local level, right? The constructed wetlands at the Stata Center it could be a study in political economy, not just the technology of the water, right? And then that scales out into the community and out into the region. So water and place-based learning around that and working in that district approach, I think is a key opportunity for us on our campuses.
So back at Kendall Square, I'll say this, and the former mayor may be interested. We've, in the last month, I guess, we've had 2 delegations, one from Austin, Texas, and one from Detroit, come to us and say, Kendall Square is the model innovation hub that has everything we aspire to. And our reaction has been, well, it's got some great things, but it has a long ways to go, and we could go through the whole list of things. Yeah. Right. But, housing is probably the most critical, but all the things that support a rich life. There's no pharmacy, there's no grocery store. You know, the density is all a whack, the diversity is not broad enough. All the things I talked about, Kendall Square pretty much falls short, except it has MIT and all these startups. There it really is a model.
René Schwarzenbach from ETH Zurich. I would like to bring back the discussion on why is this interface between science and society so poorly, why do we so poorly in this interface? And the question has something to do with education. And the question has something to do with an academic system that I think goes crazy. With respect that the worst people of trying to fill, or the worst people, if you talk about sustainability, are the faculty, because they are not rewarded for doing that. They are punished if they do that. So, and on the other hand, we educate the leaders, global leaders of the future world. But we educate them in disciplinary thinking. We don't educate them in holistic, system-oriented thinking. And when I talk about system, I don't mean traffic systems or something like that. I mean also societal systems. So the question is, what can we do? Or what can the leading universities do? Leading means sort of defined by the ranking we have right now. Maybe they would be leading if the ranking would be a little bit, others would be leading if the ranking would be a little bit different. So I want to be a little bit provocative, but I think we should think about this. And we should not think only about how can we make something more efficient, but how can we get holistic thinking into the heads of our students. And MOOCs and sitting at home is not helping.
So two things. One, I don't want to go away you thinking that I was advocating for MOOCs.
No.
Because I really wasn't. I was suggesting, though, two things. One is that let's be very honest about the resource intensity of the service that we're delivering. Two, let's be very honest about the resource intensity of the different segments of the population that are resident of users of our universities. So faculty who commute in and drive, that should be considered part of the sustainability of a campus, because the university could provide subsidies or other modes or whatever for faculty housing or whatever. That's really, I think, it's uncomfortable, because there was a paper, Soloff and others' paper on the 1 billion highest emitters. The argument was that instead of talking about individual countries and their contribution to the Kyoto protocols, and let's not talk about countries, let's talk about populations across countries. And the 1 billion highest emitters contributed something like 95% of CO2 emissions, the wealthy around the world. And not just in the wealthiest country, but the wealthy everywhere, right? And so again, I think it's a little bit uncomfortable, but if we could establish what full professors, what is their energy material consumption per year, what's the junior professors, what's the students, what's the staff, and all of that, and then begin to say, are there efficiencies that can be had easily?
No, I'm completely with you, but it's good to show the professors the mirror and say, look at yourself. But the next step is to change the culture of a university.
Yeah, so let me address that. So, John, I want to be a little more radical. Okay. And I'll give an answer that I heard Nicholas Negroponte give about 10 years ago in a public forum, asked about how can you get people to work together and to innovate in academia more readily. And his answer, to probably get me run off the campus, but was to get rid of tenure. And because tenure, for junior faculty, it does two things. It forces them to find a very narrow specialty and drill very deep into it. And it removes all incentives for collaboration, because if you work with somebody else, you may not get credit for that joint work. And then for senior faculty, not so much at Harvard and MIT, because I think people are very driven there, but in many places, it removes incentives to innovate and to develop new ideas and to really really push the envelope. I think the incentives are all aligned against holistic thinking, generally in the university, towards narrow specialties.
What do we do about it?
Get rid of tenure. Okay, are we out of time? Thank you very much. This has been great.